Hello, everyone. We now would like to introduce Blair Fraser, Vice President of Business Development for UE Systems. It is my pleasure to share with you his presentation, pre-recorded, why maintenance and reliability communications goes wrong and how to fix it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hey, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending which time zone you are on. My name is Blair Fraser, and for this session, what we're going to talk about is why maintenance and reliability communications goes wrong, and more importantly, how to fix it. We're going to look at some of the tips and tricks, but also some of the pitfalls we fall into as technical specialists, something that is called the curse of knowledge, when we have so much knowledge to share, and our audience isn't at that same level. And that's typically what happens in these types of presentations, in the technical world we live in, that we just aren't able to get our point across or persuade the audience to take the action they want to take. So I want to walk you through a little bit of a real life, some names have changes scenario. So picture this, you're sitting beside me at a conference. This is a big conference. The room is just full of thousands of people, right? And the head honcho, the CEO of whatever company comes up on stage, right? And they start to tell you the top 10 things we must get right in maintenance and reliability this year. This is a very seasoned speaker. He checks all the boxes that we're typically told to check. He has stage presence. He has eye contact. And oh my gosh, is he dressed up. He looks fantastic. And here's the catch. There was no depressing slide deck. In fact, the only slide that he had in this whole presentation stayed up there the entire time. It was the 10 things that we must get right this year in maintenance and reliability in order to be successful. In this scenario, now I'm giving you a hypothetical situation, but in this scenario, it wasn't on the top 10 things that maintenance and reliability professionals must get right. In this case, it was a company, and it was the top 10 things that they must get right this year in order to be successful. So at the end of this conclusion, there's a standing ovation. Everyone is cheering. They are motivated. This presentation appeared to be world class, but there was one fundamental thing missing from this presentation. There was no effective transfer of ideas. Nothing actually stuck. In fact, it was only 80% of the message. 80% of the message did not stick. So why does that happen? Well, what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is three things. Why communications is important, what we mostly get wrong, and how we can fix it. So this is a quote by billionaire William Buffett, who says, your ability to communicate and influence others is the number one skill that will boost your career value by 50%. Throughout time, communication has been our most powerful tool. It's not just we have to give and receive information. It's really how we get what we want. We might not think we're giving a presentation or using communication, we want to pick the movie we want to see, when we want to get that new job, when we want to get that budget approved, you want that cool new gadget that's funded, right? All of that comes down to your ability to communicate, which directly impacts your ability to influence and persuade. So great communication is an extreme advantage. I've learned to, over trial and error, be able to really fine-tune the art of communication as a practitioner, as a salesperson, as a vendor, as a business owner, and most recently trying to secure venture capitalist funds for a startup, which is probably my most humble moment as a communicator. So what's the problem? The problem is we're not naturally very effective at communications. We all struggle with it. The data supports this. Less than 1/3 of business presentations are deemed good or better. So less than 1/3 of business presentations are deemed good or better. Now, this is a study done by Oradium, which I'm going to reference their framework and material quite a bit through this presentation. So in fact, 2/3 are considered mediocre or worse, right? The reality is we don't set out to punish our audience. We don't want this ineffective communication. So what's happening? Well, the reality is we get lured away and do stupid things. That's just the reality. That's what we do. So what I want to do here is I want to ask you guys a question. So using the chat function here, I'm going to ask you to put the first thing that comes into your mind. So what are some of the typical things you see in business or conference presentations you attend? And this isn't to go against anyone that has presented prior to this or will present after. Even consider just some you may have went through the prior session before this. What are some of the things that you see? What I'll do is I'll count down, just give you a few more seconds. You can just put that in the chat, just a single word or a short little sentence about what you see. And I can tell you what we typically get back. This is a study done by, again, Oradium, is here's the typical answers. Too much information. It's all about the speaker. In fact, a lot of conferences make us talk about ourselves beforehand. In fact, if you've ever been to any of my presentations, I will cut it out. In fact, the way I started this presentation, I said my name and what I'm here about. I didn't give my credentials. I didn't say how long I've been in the business because this doesn't apply at this point in this presentation. So all about the speakers. It's generally boring, which can happen. Something that you've probably heard many, many times, death by PowerPoint. And let me be the first to tell you, I'm not against PowerPoint. I use PowerPoint. I use Prezi. I use a lot of different platforms in order to get information out. But PowerPoint is not the issue. Okay. Now, I can tell you if you want some tips and tricks on PowerPoint, they have come a long way. There's a lot of new features. There are rehearsal things you can do to make sure you're not going to do some of these. But again, PowerPoint is not the issue. Too many bullets. It's too long. It's too technical, right? And here's the interesting thing. Even if I go through the chat of what you guys put in there, we naturally go to the negative about presentations, right? About communications. We automatically say, hey, it's too long. No one said, hey, what do you typically see? They're spot on. They're fantastic. They were able to communicate the ideas and things like that. So where did we go wrong? Where did we go wrong? Well, the real reason we present badly is because we don't know the rules that govern great communications, right? In fact, if you go through, depending on your generation, if you go back to when you went to school and you had to present, some of us didn't have computers when we were going through public school, grade school, and things like that. So it came later in our life. PowerPoint came out, and we were taught to, put our ideas down, put the points we wanted to talk about down, which in fact is the inverse, is the opposite of what we want to do, right? We do what's naturally makes sense to us as we already have the information in our head. So we think about it from our point of view, and we don't focus on the audience. I'm going to tell you, if you take anything from this presentation, if you do one thing differently, is focus on the audience and not on you, not on getting your name out there, not on getting who you are, all that kind of information, and you focus solely on what you believe the audience needs to take away, you will change the way you communicate. And I will give you a recommended framework on how to focus on the audience and not on yourself. The single biggest key to extraordinary communication is one simple idea. I referred to it earlier about being audience-centric. That's really a tactic, something that stayed with me for decades. And I learned this from Tim Pollard at Oradium. Again, I'm going to mention this company and the book, The Effective Communicator, a number of times. I think it will change the way you look at communication. And the key is this. Whenever you communicate what you are trying to do is powerfully land a small number of big ideas. So powerfully land a small number of big ideas. Why is it a small number of big ideas? Because the brain doesn't do very well at storing and retrieving facts and data, especially large quantities of it. And what do we have in our heads as technical people? A lot of data and a lot of ideas, right? And large quantities of it. But human brain traffics very well in ideas. Everything we do as presenter needs to be about finding and nailing those big ideas that emerges from your data, rather than just the data. So the data supports the big idea. Is exactly what the human brain wants. The idea simply snaps into place as though we're saying, that's it. And if you've ever been in a presentation where someone goes, that is powerfully landing that big idea. So let me give you a situation. Let's say you were told you have to give a presentation. You naturally start thinking about the slides. What most people often do is open up PowerPoint and start typing away. The reality is, as Tim says, PowerPoint is like tequila. They're not inherently evil, but given the right circumstances, they will make you do some stupid stuff. And this is one thing I'll ask your next presentation that you have to do. Don't start in PowerPoint. Start on a piece of paper and write down your ideas, and I'm going to give you a framework to do that. Don't start just putting slides into PowerPoint. In fact, I end up traveling quite a bit. Whenever I'm on airplanes, I like to look around to see what other people are doing. Two things. One, I'm curious what they're working on, and two, I'm very nosy. But it's interesting. I see PowerPoint all the time, specifically on my flights over to New York, where it's business related. A lot of business people, they'll have PowerPoint up. And I've never ever seen anyone taking slides away. I've only seen them adding to their PowerPoint deck. So let's go back to the 10 things we must get right presentation that I talked about earlier. When I said 80% of it didn't stick, how do we know that? When random people were asked 10 minutes after the presentation if they could list just any of the 10 things, the max most people could list was 2. That tells us that mostly of what they told us about communication was wrong, style over substance, while the message was motivation. I can tell you, in the real scenario of that situation, that CEO did not want to, yes, motivation is a byproduct, but I'm sure he wanted the people in the audience to start thinking about those 10 things, not just 2, those 10, right? So we have to look at things a little bit different. So when we're looking at presenting or communicating an idea, powerfully landing a small number of big ideas, what are we trying to accomplish, or what does success look like? And this is where I think we often get it wrong. I think it's going to be easier if I draw it for you. So when we look at our meetings, typically, we're presenting to someone in particular, and there might be a group of people, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to present this knowledge or this idea to get that aha moment. And this is our first meeting, right? So we often think of our success of our presentation like this. So we go back to that person that did that, the 10 things we must do right. And where they failed is what is I'm going to say is the most important thing about communication. Again, I'm going to tell you it's the most important thing you can do in a presentation. And it's this, is most decisions. So when you are trying to present, you're trying to get someone to take an action, right? There's always an outcome that you want them to do, whether it's to follow up the sale, set a demo, so fund your project, set up the next meeting. There's always an action you want them to do. So we have this first meeting, and this is how we typically judge success. But that's not really what happens in real life. What happens is there is always a second meeting where this person has to retell their story, the benefits, the beliefs to other people. So how effectively can they transfer your ideas, that small number of big ideas, to a second group of audience? This is what always happens. And this is what makes communications very, very important. This is probably the most important thing, is this concept of re-tellability. This is probably the most important thing about a presentation, is the ability for that person, once they leave your presentation, is to retell that story. Now, here's the caveat. They're not going to retell it exactly the same way you did. So that's why narrowing it down to a small number of big ideas is very, very important. So if they walk away and these are the 3 things you want them to do and they can retell those 3 things, that is the most important part. So the right question is your message so clear? Is it so crisp? Is it so compelling you can achieve that second meeting success? So I'm going to leave you with a framework on how you start to figure out what content, what design, what messaging you want in your presentation. Again, this is for the Oradium process. In a fundamental way, every presentation is about something. It has to be audience-centric. We need a place at the center, and that center of your presentation is the audience. The nucleus is the audience. Everything gravitates around that audience. If you don't know your audience, then you shouldn't be doing that presentation. As simple as it seems, it's often not done in practice. We need to orient around the audience. So if you start your presentation, and if any vendors are listening to sales presentations, and you start off as this is how many years we're in business, this is the size of our building, look at us, we have a moat around us, or we have a bridge, you're failing. Your audience is not going to buy a product because of your building. Your message might be around, hey, we're funded enough, we're big enough to support you, but there's different means of doing it other than starting your slide deck with 15 slides about who we are. You always start with your audience in mind. So let's say you have to give it a presentation. You start to think about the slides. Most people open up PowerPoint and start to dive in, just adding slides, right? That's not what we're trying to do here. So as you begin to build any presentation, you start with the question, as a result of this presentation, what do I want my audience to do? This is the action. This is the do part of it. This is what we want to do. So what do I want my audience to do? You start with this phase first. Everything builds from that. What action do I want my audience to take? This is the top of the pyramid. You fill in the action there. Remember, your audience is also self-interested. They will act because it helps them, not because it helps you. In human beings, action is preceded by belief. I'm going to say this again. Action is preceded by belief. In other words, we make a decision when we have established certain beliefs about that decision. So the second part, the insights. What do I need my audience to believe? This is the second part. What do I need them to believe? I need them to believe that without my solution, their life is going to be crap, right? So we have to think about what do they need to believe. The next thing we need to do is these beliefs are your presentation big ideas, right? This is where they come from. And if you look at that in the dictionary, what a definition of a conclusion you draw for the first time or presented with new information, it's an insight. How many insights can you have? Around 3 or 4. Any more than that, you're failing to land a small number of big ideas. So finally, we have this bottom level, the data and illustrations. And this is often, as technical professionals, where we live. We start our presentation, end our presentation, and in the middle of our presentation is around data and illustrations, when in fact it should be around the beliefs. So these data and illustrations are to support this belief, right? We don't want to list, complex drawings and things like that, but what data and illustrations can I use in my presentation to support those beliefs? And so really the best arguments are made by focusing on a small number of highly loaded bearing proofs, not assembling every possible data point you can lay your hands on. Audience quickly become lost if you try to provide an insight with too much data. So in summary, always start with the action or the do. What do you want your customers to do after this presentation? What beliefs do you need them to believe in order to take that action, and how do you support those beliefs? And if you do those 3 things and architect your presentation with that, now I can go into a lot more detail about how you design your presentation, leap from one subject to the other, integrate it all in. But if you just follow this pyramid, anchor it in your customer problem, focus on the audience, and follow this from top to bottom, I guarantee you your presentations will be better. So what I want to do is leave you with some rules, some ideas, some tips and tricks, if you will. And the first thing you're going to notice is I'm using bullet points. But take a look at how I'm using them. So great communication design designs proportion into their talks. They linger where the audience wants them to linger. And for us, the ability to be silent is so hard. The ability just to sit there and let the audience digest information. All of us want to talk, right? Because we have so much knowledge in our head. The ability just to sit there and linger and quickly move through points that are less interesting. That is something highly rewarding to an audience when the presenter breezes through a trivial but digs into the meaty. So one of the things we get wrong in our presentations from this curse of knowledge from being technical experts is this idea of quantity. So rule number 1, critical content only. Sharply focus on the most important ideas while jet setting on the secondary content that may be interesting, but that you can't afford to include. So you have to know your timing. Is this half an hour presentation? Is this an hour presentation? And just focus on critical content only. Ruthless, and I mean ruthless, elimination of repetition. For some reason, we love repeating the same things over and over again for too much. Now, again, I'm not against repeating things. You'll see me do it many times, but most presentations repeat themselves far, far too much. They often use multiple stories to illustrate a single point or lots of data that shows the same thing. Stop proving what has already been proved. If your audience is, yep, they've got it. We don't need to prove it anymore. Rule number 3, be as brief as possible. This is going to be a challenge. Finally, within the stories you tell, be a minimalist and concise. Right? How many times have you heard someone, oh, I remember I was visiting a site, and where was it? Oh, I think it was in San Francisco. No, maybe it was Milwaukee. The location probably doesn't matter in that story, right? You're not being brief. Really, hey, I visited a customer that had a similar situation, right? The location doesn't matter. So be minimalist and concise. Interesting sidebars and intellectual sidebars are where presentations go to die. How many times have we seen this? Okay, we got to get back on track, guys. Thank you for doing that. So you have to be a little ruthless and be as brief as possible. We recommend that in addition to a primary handout. So how many times have you been asked, hey, can I have a copy of your slide deck? Right? And I have seen people add slides into their slide deck. Well, I know they're going to want a copy of this, right? So the way to get around that is build a secondary handout, build an appendix. That appendix can be your best friend. Don't have it on the main screen. Say, hey, if you want information about this study, it's an appendix. I'll send you a link to it. You can read about it there, right? All that secondary material can be available to them, so you don't get off to a sidebar. So start to think about what other complementary material you need in order to reduce the quantity of your presentation. So one of the other problems we have as technical specialists, that curse of knowledge, is complexity. We have a tendency to add too much complexity into our presentation. Most people present with their own areas of expertise. So that's the reason we're presenting. We're an expert in this field, where everything we're talking about is completely familiar to us, but we fail to spot the complexity that maybe is innocent as one acronym. Just one can derail that whole presentation. Really what this is called is complexity blindness. The longer you've been in your industry, the longer you've spoken the language of your tribe, the harder it is even to notice that this isn't the language of the people you're presenting to. So how do we solve this? So rule number 1, intentionally scrutinize for simplicity. Carefully review all your content for complexity. The golden rule of technical presentations is this: the conclusions from the data are significantly more important than the details of the data. So I'm going to say this again: the conclusion of the data from a technical presentations are significantly more important than the details of the data. Rule number 2, draw the conclusion for the audience. Tell your audience what the work means for them. Don't ask them to do the highly difficult job of identifying your insights. That's your job. Your job is to connect the dots. Never assume that your audience will draw the conclusion they think you'll draw, no matter how obvious it seems to them. And rule number 3, be careful to use the audience language and be particularly careful with unexplained terms. Gosh, we have a lot of technical terms in our industry. Technical terms and acronyms are probably the worst landmines of the battlefields of hidden complexity. We need to always remember that people don't like it when we use terms or acronyms that they don't understand. How many times have you been presented or been in a presentation and he has someone awkwardly wave their hand. The presenter is 3 slides down, so that person's mind is stuck on those 3 slides prior. Said, what does RCM stand for again? Right? So they've lost everything you've been talking about. There's a sobering principle to be aware of here for anyone selling their ideas. People don't buy what they don't understand. So those are the 3 rules to solve complexity blindness. So my big ask in this presentation is for this community. If you are given a presentation, regardless of the industry you're in, if you're trying to get something approved, I don't care what industry, what you're trying to get approved, if you have any ideas of how you could make a better presentation, you can communicate that more effectively. If you want to understand the pyramid a little bit better, run it by me. This is my personal email. Say, hey, Blair, I sat through your presentation. I'd love to take a look at this presentation. I am more than happy to dedicate time to go through this messaging architecture and to look at, from a layman's point of view, are you adding complexity? Are you being as simple as possible? Are you focusing on the audience? What are your beliefs that you want the audience to believe? And how are you supporting that with data and illustrations? So thank you very much. I'll hang on for any questions.
Hello, Blair.
Hello.
Any questions? Anyone in the audience? I have a quick question or comment. Blair, very often we hear sometimes in presentations that we should do is tell them what you're going to tell them, tell it to them, and then at the end, tell them again, or writing in the conclusions. What are your thoughts about that? I think this is slightly different from that.
It is, yeah, that's a great question. It's slightly different. And the way I look at things is from a scientific human approach. And I'm not a psychologist or psychologist, but what the research does tell us is if you preload the agenda, now this is different for internal meetings. This is when you're presenting something. If you load the agenda, the human brain will naturally start to figure out what it doesn't need to attend and check out from and what it does. So if you have a really solid agenda, then that will work. But more importantly, where I've seen it work the best is instead of putting the agenda, so first we're going to talk about this, first we're going to talk about this. If you notice in my presentation, the first thing I talk about is why is communication important, right? How we can fix it, right? And so leading those big ideas, and those are really my big ideas, leading with the big ideas, not necessarily a time-driven agenda, but leading with those beliefs. So thank you for joining me today. What I'm going to start with today is I'm going to get you to believe that, you know, a minivan is the best vehicle for a young family, right? And so we're not set the agenda as that, but as that big idea and mapping it towards there, I think you'd have the best outcome.
Mm. Great, that's a very good suggestion. Any other comments from anyone in the audience?
Either people might be a little bit upset with me because they realized maybe I challenged them a little bit on their presentations. Specifically, anybody that might be presenting after me is like, but we've all done it, right? And Alona had a great comment there, guilty of making some of those. And even in that presentation, just watching it again, I was guilty, right? I failed with one animation in particular. So I think the takeaway doesn't have to be perfect, but if you have, end of the day, if you focus on the audience first, you change your mindset, the audience first, you will be light years ahead, right?
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much, Blair, for this very interesting presentation. I think it can help us all. So
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.